Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Let's get started. It was one of those serene afternoons that only the Savoy Hotel seemed capable of conjuring. The polished silver teapots gleamed under the gentle light, and a faint hum of conversation blended with the soft clink of fine china. I had always considered myself a man of reasonable taste, but seated opposite Hercule Poirot, my humble preferences seemed almost barbaric. Poirot, with his immaculate moustaches perfectly symmetrical and his napkin folded with military precision, surveyed his surroundings with the air of a man inspecting a priceless painting. His cup of tisane remained untouched, as he devoted himself entirely to the art of observation. "Observe, mon ami," he murmured. "The English, they love the ritual of tea, but they do not understand it." I had barely opened my mouth to respond when a loud voice shattered the delicate atmosphere. A portly man at the far end of the room was gesticulating wildly, his American accent carrying across the hushed elegance like a foghorn in a chapel. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "I think, Hastings, that the tranquility of our afternoon is about to end." And so it was that we were introduced, rather noisily, to Mr. Franklin P. Van Alden. "Outrageous! Preposterous!" the words rang out, drawing curious glances from neighbouring tables. Van Alden, his face flushed a shade too close to his burgundy waistcoat, jabbed a finger at the bewildered maître d'. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded, though it appeared that the staff and half of London already did. "I demand to know who placed that infernal call this morning. You hear me? Demand." A murmur of polite disapproval rippled across the room. The English are not fond of scenes, and this was most certainly a scene. Poirot's eyebrows lifted in silent amusement, while I, more easily embarrassed, focused intently on my scone. "I do not like this man's tie, Hastings," Poirot observed quietly. "It is too loud for such a respectable establishment." That was Poirot for you, spotting aesthetic crimes before actual ones. The maître d', caught between discretion and duty, merely assured Mr. Van Alden that no unauthorized calls had been put through. This only inflamed the tycoon further. That voice, it knew too much, and that letter, devil take it all. At this, Poirot's eyes sparkled with interest. A man publicly unravelling, a mysterious call, and a sinister letter, the game had begun. It was inevitable that Van Alden's wild tirade would eventually settle on Poirot. The maître d', perhaps sensing that the presence of the renowned detective might restore order, discreetly whispered Poirot's name. Van Alden's head swiveled toward our table like a gun turret locking onto its target. "Monsieur Poirot, isn't it?" He strode over, his manner abrupt but tinged with something close to desperation. "I know you. Everyone does. I need your help." Poirot's moustache twitched in modest acknowledgement, but he said nothing, allowing Van Alden's story to tumble out in a breathless flood. "It's no secret who I am, or what's at stake. My merger deal. Biggest in years. Plenty of people want to see me ruined. But this morning, I got a phone call. Voice disguised, I think. It said my next call would seal my fate." He dropped a crumpled letter onto our table, trembling slightly. Typed in block capitals, it repeated the same cryptic warning. Poirot unfolded it delicately, as though handling a rare manuscript. "Someone's playing a very dangerous game," Van Alden muttered. "My enemies are many, and my friends, well, they're hard to count." Poirot leaned back, fingertips together, eyes half closed. "Mon cher monsieur, you say many people wish you ruined, but do any wish you dead?" The colour drained from Van Alden's face. Poirot had touched the nerve beneath the bluster. "I don't know," he admitted, "but if they do, you must find them before they do." Van Alden's fingers trembled slightly as he placed the typed letter on the table between us. The paper was cheap hotel stationery, the typewritten letters slightly misaligned, as if produced by a machine well past its prime. Poirot examined it with exaggerated delicacy, tilting his head first to the left, then to the right. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured. "This is not the work of a professional blackmailer, no. The quality of the paper, it offends the dignity of such a man. And the type? Ah, it speaks of haste, of urgency, perhaps even fear." I squinted at the message, though the words themselves were unremarkable. "Your next phone call will seal your fate." "What do you make of it, Poirot?" I asked. Poirot twirled the letter between his fingertips, then laid it flat once more. "The hand that composed this message, mon ami, did not do so for money alone. There is, I think, a personal venom here, a certain glee in the phrasing." Van Alden leaned forward, sweat glistening at his temple. "It came this morning, slipped under my door. No one saw who delivered it." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And yet, monsieur, you answered the telephone, yes? Why, if you were afraid—" Van Alden's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because the voice knew too much." "What voice?" I blurted. Van Alden's face paled. "My first wife. But that's impossible. She's been dead for years." Poirot's expression was at once amused and intrigued. "Impossible, you say? Let us not be too hasty with impossibilities." The moment Van Alden left us to recover his nerves, Poirot leaned back, his eyes narrowing in thought. "A man such as that, mon ami. He does not arrive at the Savoy without leaving a trail of enemies." I nodded, stirring my tea absent-mindedly. "Plenty of people would want to see him out of the way, no doubt. That merger of his is in every paper." "Exactement." Poirot's fingertips touched, forming his familiar steeple of thought. "And who stands to profit, should our loud friend vanish from the boardroom?" I considered this. "His rivals, certainly. That Pembroke fellow, he's been trying to outbid Van Alden for years. And what about his family? Millionaires don't always make affectionate fathers." Poirot nodded approvingly. "His daughter, yes. I read something of her, estranged from her father after a quarrel over money. And then," I added, warming to the speculation, "there's that secretary of his. What was her name? Brinkerhoff. Always lurking in the background." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Hastings. You list suspects before we have a body. It is both premature and yet charming." I frowned. "But you do think someone's after him?" Poirot's smile faded. "Mon ami, a man does not fear a telephone call unless he has already heard something that chills his blood. This letter, this voice, they are not the beginning. They are the culmination of something long buried." Suddenly, the telephone rang. Poirot's eyes flicked toward it. "Shall we discover if fate is punctual, mon cher?" Van Alden returned just as the telephone rang again. The sound was somehow shrill, discordant in the opulence of the suite. For a moment he froze, his gaze fixed upon the gleaming receiver as though it were a loaded pistol. Poirot stood, his gesture graceful. "Permit me, monsieur." Van Alden snatched up the receiver before Poirot could intervene. "Who's there?" His voice cracked with tension. We heard nothing, only Van Alden's breathing, fast, shallow, as if he were climbing a steep hill. A moment later he collapsed, the telephone slipping from his hand. I sprang forward. "Good heavens! Is he—" Poirot knelt beside the fallen man, his fingers pressing gently against Van Alden's neck. "He is not dead, but neither is he well." Poirot's brow furrowed. "This is no ordinary collapse." He glanced at the dangling receiver, still swaying slightly. "Hastings, note this well. The voice that frightened him came not from the room, nor from the air, but from the heart." I had no idea what he meant, but the urgency in his tone left me cold. "Summon the hotel doctor," Poirot said softly. "And Hastings, be prepared. I fear this is only the beginning." The doctor arrived swiftly, but even his experienced hands could not explain what had happened. Van Alden lay in a stupor, his pulse racing, his forehead clammy. No sign of poison, no injury, nothing at all to account for the collapse. Poirot stood by the window, his arms folded, gazing down at the bustling street below. When he turned, his expression was almost serene. "Hastings," he said with quiet satisfaction. "I have often remarked that fate has a sense of theatre." I stared at him. "You mean, you're taking the case?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "But of course." He gestured to the room, the letter, the man sprawled senseless upon the bed. How could I resist such a stage? A billionaire, a warning letter, a ghostly voice, and a telephone that brings death. He adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his tie. "Mon ami, Hercule Poirot has been invited to a most curious performance." The moment Van Alden had been taken to the hotel's medical suite, Poirot swept into action. It was a transformation I had seen many times before. The lounging dandy replaced by the meticulous investigator, his keen little eyes darting across the room, seeing what no ordinary man could ever hope to notice. We stood in the luxurious suite, the kind only the fabulously wealthy could afford. A room where every surface seemed to gleam and every cushion appeared never to have been sat upon. And yet, there was a sense of disarray, a subtle chaos left in the wake of fear. Poirot's attention was immediately drawn to the telephone. It hung awkwardly from its cradle, the receiver swinging slightly, as if the ghost of the conversation still lingered in the air. "You observe, Hastings," Poirot murmured, his fingertips brushing the handset before wiping them carefully with his handkerchief. "This telephone, it is no ordinary instrument of communication. It is the weapon." I stared. "The weapon? But there's no sign of injury. No one attacked him." Poirot's smile was thin. "Physical injury, non. But there are other ways to strike at a man's heart." He moved to the table where the infamous typed letter lay. Picking it up delicately, he examined it once more. "It is the second time I hold this paper," he said. "And still, it tells me nothing. Or rather, it tells me too much." I watched as he scanned the room methodically. The half-empty glass of water, the perfectly aligned newspapers, the carefully folded silk dressing gown. Then, quite suddenly, Poirot's gaze fixed upon the telephone cord. He crouched beside it, tracing the line with a fingertip until he reached the wall socket. Curious, very curious indeed. He stood abruptly. "Hastings, do you notice what is missing?" I glanced around helplessly. "Missing? Everything seems present and correct to me." Poirot sighed. "Mon pauvre Hastings. You see, but you do not observe. There is no ashtray. And yet, our Mr. Van Alden smokes cigars." Before I could respond, Poirot gave a sharp nod. "The truth, Hastings, it hides in these little details. And now we must speak with those who guard these little details best, the staff." The assistant manager, a thin man with an unfortunate habit of blinking excessively, stood uneasily before Poirot. I rather imagined he was used to handling complaints about tepid tea or wrinkled sheets, not interrogations by world-famous detectives. "Tell me," Poirot began, his voice smooth as crème anglaise, "who is responsible for connecting the telephone calls to the rooms?" The man blinked twice before responding. "The switchboard operator, monsieur. No external call can reach a guest's room without first passing through her." "Bon. And this morning, did any call come through to Mr. Van Alden's suite?" The man's brow furrowed. "Non, monsieur. The only call to that suite came from within the hotel itself, from the front desk." I glanced at Poirot, baffled. "But we heard it ring." "He answered it, right in front of us." Poirot raised a finger. "Exactly, Hastings. We witnessed the call, but the call did not exist. Fascinating, n'est-ce pas?" The assistant manager gave a nervous cough. "It's possible the call was made directly from another room. Internal calls wouldn't always pass through the switchboard." Poirot nodded slowly. "And who, pray, would have known that detail?" "Any regular guest," the manager admitted. "Or a member of the staff." Poirot tapped his fingertips together. "Aha, The circle tightens. We were taken down to the small, cluttered room housing the hotel switchboard. A young woman with ginger curls and a harassed expression greeted us. She was polite, but clearly intimidated by Poirot's presence. "You personally handled Mr. Van Alden's calls?" Poirot asked. "Yes, sir," she said nervously. "But I swear there was nothing unusual." "Nothing unusual," Poirot echoed softly. "And yet a man lies unconscious, terrified by the impossible call." He leaned closer. "Mademoiselle, the impossible always has an explanation. It is merely the truth in disguise." The girl blinked rapidly, as though desperate to conjure an answer. I did see something, sir, but I didn't think it was important." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "Aha! Speak, if you please." "A maid," she whispered. "I saw her near Mr. Van Alden's suite just before the call rang through. I thought she was delivering towels, but she wasn't carrying anything." Poirot's smile was warm. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have helped more than you know." We stepped back into the corridor, and Poirot gave a small, triumphant nod. "The little maid who brings no towels, already, she intrigues me. Let us find her, Hastings, for if I am not mistaken, she knows more than fresh linen." Dorothy Van Alden received us in a small, private lounge, her slender figure framed against the window's dull grey light. She was not at all what I expected from the daughter of a notorious tycoon. There was no flash of wealth, no arrogance. Instead, her face was pale, drawn into an expression of practiced indifference. She barely acknowledged me, her eyes fixed instead on Poirot, studying him with the guarded wariness of someone who had long ago learned to distrust charm. "So, you've come to ask about my father," she said without preamble. Her voice was low, flat. "You may as well know, I don't pretend to grieve." Hastings, ever the champion of family values, looked horrified. Poirot, however, merely inclined his head. "Mademoiselle, one does not require affection to understand a man. It is perhaps easier when there is none." Dorothy's mouth twisted into a smile that was all bitterness and no joy. "Understand him? I don't believe anyone ever did. Certainly not me." Poirot's fingertips pressed together. "And yet, mademoiselle, you were once his dearest treasure." She gave a short laugh. "That was before the merger, before the new fortune made him forget his old responsibilities, before he married my mother, and forgot her too." "Resentment. It is a curious poison, is it not?" Poirot said softly. "It does not kill immediately, but it burns." Dorothy's gaze sharpened. "If you're suggesting I had something to do with what happened to him, you're wasting your time. I hated him, yes. I resented him, absolutely. But I didn't wish him dead." Poirot raised a hand. "Ah, but I did not ask if you wished him dead, mademoiselle. I asked if you understood him." That gave her pause. "He was afraid," she said at last. "That much I understood. Afraid of growing old, of being forgotten, of losing the power he thought made him important. And the phone call this morning? The letter?" She shook her head. "I knew nothing of that until I read about it. But I'll say this. Whoever sent that letter knew my father better than I ever did." Poirot stood, bowing slightly. "Merci, mademoiselle. The truth. It peeks out from behind the curtains. One must only know where to look." We found Charles Pembroke in the hotel bar, a place where deals were made and, I suspected, more than one reputation had been discreetly destroyed. Pembroke was exactly as the financial papers described him, sleek, immaculately groomed and sharp-eyed, like a fox in a tailor-made suit. He did not rise when we approached, merely offering Poirot a thin smile and a handshake that was neither warm nor cold. "I expected you," he said simply. "Van Alden attracts drama like a corpse attracts flies." "A most poetic observation, monsieur," Poirot replied, seating himself with care. "And where were you, if you please, at the time of this morning's unfortunate event?" Pembroke's smile did not flicker. "At my club. I have 6 members who'll swear to it. I ordered breakfast at 9, read the papers, and left shortly after 11. And yet, Poirot said mildly, you were seen returning to the hotel briefly around 10:30. A curious gap, n'est-ce pas? Pembroke's expression remained smooth. A forgotten umbrella. Naturally, the Englishman's constant companion. Poirot's smile was equally thin. And did your forgotten umbrella happen to lead you near Mr. Van Alden's suite? I couldn't say, Pembroke replied smoothly. But if you're implying I had something to do with his collapse, you're giving me far too much credit. I would never have scared him to death. I would have outbid him. Far more satisfying. Perhaps, Poirot said softly. But fear, it is a weapon as potent as any dagger, and far easier to conceal. Pembroke took a sip of his single malt, eyes glittering over the rim of his glass. You won't find anything tying me to that letter, if that's what you're after. I fight my battles in boardrooms, not hotel suites. Poirot stood, smoothing his cuffs. I wonder, monsieur, if perhaps this battle began long before the boardroom, before letters and phone calls, before even the merger. I wonder if it began in the heart. Pembroke's smile faltered, just for a moment. Whatever you say, Poirot, but you'll find my heart completely unaffiliated with this mess. As we walked away, Poirot's face was serene. Hastings, what do you make of Monsieur Pembroke? A scoundrel, I muttered, and rather too smooth. Precisely, mon ami. And when a man is too smooth, one must wonder, what does he polish so diligently? Lydia Cartwright was every inch the modern beauty, sleek, poised and elegant in a way that seemed carefully calculated rather than natural. She greeted us in the private sitting room she had commandeered at the Savoy, her expression fixed in a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. I have never considered myself particularly shrewd when it comes to the female mind, but even I could detect a certain nervousness beneath her polished exterior. Her fingers toyed ceaselessly with the string of pearls around her neck, her gaze flickering toward the window whenever Poirot's questions became too direct. Miss Cartwright, Poirot began, his tone gentle, almost paternal. It was a shock for you, yes, to see Mr. Van Alden collapse so suddenly. She gave a graceful shrug. Franklin was a man under pressure. He had enemies, of course, but he also had his fears. And fears, Monsieur Poirot, can be terribly unhealthy. Indeed, especially when they come to life, n'est-ce pas? Poirot's gaze sharpened. And this morning, before the unfortunate event, what was your last conversation with him? Lydia's smile faltered. It was nothing of consequence. We discussed the wedding plans. Ah, but it was not nothing of consequence, mademoiselle. Poirot leaned forward, fingers tented. You see, I have already learned that there was a quarrel. About loyalty. Yours, and perhaps his own. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the pearls. Franklin accused me of seeing someone else. It was absurd, of course. And was there someone else? I asked, perhaps more bluntly than Poirot would have approved. Lydia's eyes flashed. Certainly not. Poirot rose, smoothing his jacket. The truth, it is like the pearl necklace you hold so tightly. It can be broken, and the pearls, they scatter. But in the end, one always finds them all. He bowed slightly. Merci, mademoiselle. As we walked out, I whispered, do you think she's hiding something? Poirot's moustache twitched mischievously. She hides many things, mon ami, but whether they are criminal or merely romantic, we shall see. If Lydia Cartwright was the picture of brittle glamour, Pauline Brinkerhoff was her opposite, a woman who had perfected the art of fading into the background. Everything about her seemed designed to be invisible. Her plain dress, her muted voice, even her posture, which seemed to shrink into itself. We found her in the hotel's business lounge, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, her hands moving efficiently over Van Alden's papers, as though the man himself were merely out for a stroll, rather than lying unconscious in a private medical suite. Miss Brinkerhoff, Poirot began with gentle courtesy, you served Mr. Van Alden for many years, I believe. 15 years, she said, not looking up from her work. Through 3 wives, 2 scandals, and more lawyers than I care to count. There was no warmth in her tone, only resignation. And yet, Poirot continued, you remained loyal. She gave a brittle smile. Loyalty isn't always a virtue, Monsieur Poirot. Sometimes it's just habit. And habit, it can become resentment, no? Poirot's voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. Pauline's pen stilled. If you're asking whether I hated him, no, I didn't. He could be difficult, yes, ungrateful certainly. But hate? That requires passion, and there was no passion left. And yet, Poirot continued, this morning you were seen tearing up a notepad. Why? Her hands flattened on the desk. It was just scribbled notes, things I wrote down when Franklin dictated. Would you be surprised, mademoiselle, if I told you I retrieved one fragment? Pauline's head snapped up. It said, Poirot continued, he knows. Must act before too late. She swallowed hard. It wasn't about Franklin. It was personal. Non, mademoiselle. It was very personal, to him. Poirot's gaze held her until she looked away. As we left, I asked, do you think she's guilty? Poirot smiled faintly. Guilt, mon ami, comes in many forms. There is guilt of action, guilt of silence, and guilt of the heart. Which one belongs to Mademoiselle Pauline? That we must discover. We found Captain Matthew Wade occupying a corner table in the hotel's reading room, a forgotten whiskey glass sitting at his elbow, the contents untouched. He was a man past his prime, with a face deeply lined by sun, sea, and disappointment. There was a quiet defiance about him, as though he had long since accepted life's knocks, but refused to bend under them. Captain Wade, I began, determined to set a conversational tone. I understand you and Mr. Van Alden were once partners. Wade gave a short laugh, one without humour. Partners, he repeated. That's a fine word for it. I was his fixer, his convenient conscience, and, when it suited him, his scapegoat. Poirot folded his hands, leaning slightly forward. You accused him, did you not, of ruining your career? Wade's gaze flicked toward Poirot. I didn't accuse him. I stated a fact. When the deal with the South American shipping company collapsed, Van Alden needed someone to blame. I was expendable. And yet you are here, Poirot observed softly. You remain in his orbit, monsieur. Not by choice, Wade muttered. Van Alden owed me. He knew it. I came to collect. A debt of honor? Or revenge? Poirot's voice was mild, almost casual, but Wade flinched slightly. I'm no murderer, Poirot. His fingers tightened around the glass. I may have wanted to see him squirm, but that's all. And your alibi this morning? I asked. I was in the billiard room from 8 until 11, Wade replied. Ask the barman. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Curious. Such an alibi. It protects you from nothing. The telephone call. It could be arranged from any point within the hotel. Wade's mouth twisted into a grim smile. You think I whispered ghost stories down the line? Van Alden wouldn't have dropped dead just because of my voice. No. But perhaps, Captain, there are other voices that trouble the guilty heart. Poirot stood, smoothing his waistcoat. I shall not keep you further, for now. As we walked away, I asked Poirot, do you believe him? Poirot's moustache gave its delicate twitch. I believe, mon ami, that truth and lies, they are sometimes brothers. It is which brother speaks loudest that interests me. It was late afternoon when Mr. Whittaker, Van Alden's solicitor, arrived at the Savoy. He was a dry, parchment-skinned man, the sort who seemed to view all human drama through a veil of detached legality. Nevertheless, even he looked faintly uncomfortable as he laid a folder on the table before Poirot. Mr. Van Alden updated his will yesterday evening, gentlemen, Whittaker announced, adjusting his spectacles. It was most unusual, hurried, you could say. Hurried decisions. They are often interesting, monsieur, Poirot murmured. Continue, if you please. Whittaker cleared his throat. The previous will left the majority of Mr. Van Alden's estate to his daughter Dorothy, with certain personal bequests to Miss Cartwright and Miss Brinkerhoff. And the new will? I prompted. His daughter is removed entirely, Whitaker said flatly. The primary beneficiary is listed only as to the party responsible for preserving my legacy and correcting my errors. The identity of that party was to be disclosed in a sealed addendum, to be opened only in the event of his death. I stared. Good heavens, what does that even mean? Poirot's expression remained unreadable. It means, Hastings, that someone expected death to come very soon indeed. Do you think the beneficiary knew? Poirot's smile was enigmatic. That, mon ami, is the question upon which our case may turn. It was the second time we visited Dorothy Van Alden, and the atmosphere had shifted. If, during our first encounter, she had been coolly detached, now there was a frayed edge to her composure. The air seemed charged, as though some invisible force held her barely in check. Poirot settled himself in a high-backed armchair, his small frame somehow dominating the room, and fixed Dorothy with that unblinking, unsettling gaze of his. Mademoiselle, he began gently, you have spoken already of your father's many flaws and of your disillusionment. But there is something you did not say, something that lies beneath the surface of your words. It is not merely resentment you feel toward your father. It is a deep, abiding hurt, is it not? Dorothy's fingers clenched in her lap, the knuckles whitening. He was my father, she said at last, but he treated me like an inconvenient memory. Memories, mademoiselle, are stubborn things. They do not go quietly. Poirot's voice was soft, almost hypnotic. You resented his marriages, his fortune, and now his fiancée. You wished perhaps to punish him, non? Dorothy's head snapped up. If you're suggesting I sent that letter or staged that ridiculous phone call, you're wrong. I might have wished him ruined, but I wouldn't have killed him. Poirot tilted his head. Killed? Ah, you are ahead of me, mademoiselle. I have not yet suggested your father is dead. Curious. Her cheeks flushed. You're playing with words. Words, mademoiselle, are my most loyal companions. Poirot leaned back. Tell me, who might your father have feared most? She hesitated. He feared losing control. He feared anyone who knew his secrets. And who knew them best? Poirot asked softly. Dorothy's eyes flickered. Pauline Brinkerhoff, she said at last. She knew everything. Poirot rose, giving a slight bow. Merci, mademoiselle. The past, it always leaves fingerprints. As we left, I turned to Poirot. Well, she certainly had motive. Poirot's expression was unreadable. Motive, mon ami, is easy to find. What interests me is opportunity and the subtle taste of guilt. Charles Pembroke awaited us in the smoking lounge, where leather armchairs and faint traces of old cigar smoke created the illusion of a gentleman's club. He was lounging with an air of practiced indifference, but the glint in his eye told me he was far from unconcerned. Back again, Poirot, he drawled. I hope you're not wasting my time. Time, after all, is money. Ah, but some time is more valuable than others, Monsieur Pembroke. For instance, the time between 10:30 and 11 this morning. Poirot settled into the chair opposite. I was at my club, as I told you. Pembroke's smile was confident, but his fingers tapped the armrest. A nervous tell, if ever I saw one. Poirot steepled his fingers. You see, monsieur, a curious thing occurred. The doorman at your club remembers you leaving at precisely 10:30. Pembroke's smile froze. Where did you go during that time? Poirot's voice was silk smooth. To retrieve my umbrella. I believe I mentioned it before. Pembroke's voice was just a fraction too quick. And you were seen near Van Alden's suite. Poirot's tone remained mild, but his eyes gleamed. Coincidence, Pembroke shrugged. I saw no one, spoke to no one. Ah, but the telephone. It does not need you to speak to someone. It only needs you to place a call. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. Pembroke leaned forward, all charm gone. Listen to me, Poirot. I wanted Van Alden out of my way, in business. Scaring him to death over a telephone? It's absurd. Absurd. Non, monsieur. It is elegant. A murder without a touch. But the elegance, it is not yours. Poirot stood, adjusting his cufflinks. I thank you for your time. As we walked out, Hastings sighed. His alibi has more holes than a cheese grater. Indeed, mon ami. But it is too clumsy. Our killer. They have the mind of an artist. This is amateur work. Lydia Cartwright greeted us in her suite, though this time her cool composure was decidedly absent. Her fingers gripped the arm of a chaise lounge, and though her smile was polite, her eyes flickered with unmistakable unease. Poirot took a seat opposite her, folding his hands neatly in his lap, his moustache twitching with quiet amusement. Mademoiselle, he began, you are, I think, a woman who is accustomed to admiration. Lydia tilted her head, her smile sharpening. You flatter me, Monsieur Poirot. Non, I observe. There is a difference. He paused, then added casually. This morning, before the unfortunate collapse of Mr. Van Alden, there was a quarrel, was there not? Her smile faltered. A private matter. Ah, but when a man fears betrayal, mademoiselle, the matter ceases to be private. It becomes public in his heart. Poirot leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. He accused you of infidelity, did he not? Lydia's fingers curled more tightly into the fabric of the chair. He was jealous. Franklin was always possessive. And was there cause for this possessiveness? Poirot's voice was gentle, but with that razor-sharp edge that I had come to recognize. No, she said swiftly. There was no one else. No one. Not even a harmless flirtation. Poirot's brows lifted, and Lydia's hesitation, no more than a heartbeat, was answer enough. There was nothing serious, she said at last. Franklin had grown so suspicious lately. Even a passing conversation with another man could set him off. And this suspicion, Poirot said softly, was it born of mere jealousy or of guilt? Guilt, Lydia frowned. The guilty heart, mademoiselle, often sees betrayal where none exists, because it knows betrayal is possible. Poirot stood, adjusting his cuffs. And tell me, this morning, did he mention a name? The name of the man he feared? Lydia shook her head. Number. But he did say something strange. He said, the past will catch me, even if you will not. I thought it was just his usual dramatics. Poirot smiled faintly. The past, mademoiselle, it never knocks. It walks straight through the door. As we left, I couldn't help but whisper to Poirot, you don't really think she had a lover, do you? Poirot's eyes twinkled. A lover, perhaps not. But a secret? Ah, that is certain. We found Pauline Brinkerhoff precisely where I expected, buried in paperwork, her posture stiff, her pen scratching furiously as though sheer industry could banish suspicion. Her face, however, gave her away. There was a tremor at the corner of her mouth, the faintest sheen of perspiration at her brow. Poirot approached with a bow so formal it might have belonged in a royal court, and Pauline almost knocked over her ink bottle in response. Mademoiselle Pauline, Poirot said softly, forgive me. I intrude. But only because the truth. She is such a shy creature. She requires coaxing. I have told you everything I know, Pauline said briskly, though her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her papers. Ah, but what you know and what you reveal, they are not always the same, no? Poirot's smile was gentle, but his eyes missed nothing. I was loyal to Mr. Van Alden, Pauline said, a little too quickly. I managed his affairs for years. Exactement. Which means you knew all his habits, his fears, even his secrets. Poirot tapped the desk lightly. And yet, When the telephone rang this morning, you were seen. Not at your desk, but near the suite itself. Pauline's lips parted, but no denial came. Instead, her hands folded together, twisting at the fingers. I was passing by. And the notepad you destroyed? Poirot's voice was silk. Was that also innocent? Pauline swallowed hard. I scribbled things down when he dictated, sometimes things that didn't matter. And yet you destroyed it. Curious, no? Poirot tapped his temple. A mind so orderly, and yet suddenly careless. Pauline's gaze dropped to her hands. I was afraid. Of what, mademoiselle? She hesitated. That voice on the phone, it was her voice. Her? I asked, bewildered. His first wife, Pauline whispered. I knew her voice. I heard it before she died. Poirot's expression did not change. But that is impossible, is it not? The dead, they do not make telephone calls. Pauline's shoulders shook. It wasn't her, I know that. But it sounded like her, exactly like her. Poirot stood, his smile small and enigmatic. Merci, mademoiselle. You see, even fear has a voice, and it can be imitated most convincingly. As we left, I tugged Poirot's sleeve. You don't really believe the dead can call, do you? Poirot gave his familiar shrug. Mon ami, I believe only in the living. It is they who possess both motive and imagination. We found Captain Matthew Wade in the hotel garden, seated on a weathered bench beneath a trellis of ivy, his hands resting lightly on his knees. He cut a curious figure, a man built for action, now perfectly still, as though the fire that had once driven him had long since burned out. Poirot approached with his usual gracious bow, while I, slightly less ceremonious, settled onto the bench beside Wade. The captain acknowledged our presence with a slight nod, but his gaze remained fixed on the gravel path ahead. Captain, Poirot began softly, you have spoken of your disappointment with Mr. Van Alden. You blame him, do you not, for your ruined career? Wade's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though there was no humour in it. Blame? That's a strong word, Poirot. Let's say I understood the game a little too late. And understanding, it brings no comfort, I think. Only resentment. Poirot's head tilted, his sharp gaze reading every flicker of expression. I had my chance to ruin him, you know, Wade said calmly. Years ago, when the deal collapsed and he left me to take the fall, I could have dragged his name through the mud. And yet you did not, Poirot observed. Curious. It wasn't worth it, Wade said simply. Men like Van Alden, they destroy themselves in the end. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone hastens the process. Poirot's voice was silk. Tell me, monsieur, where were you this morning, at the time of the incident? I told you, the billiard room. Playing alone, or with company? Alone. How convenient. Poirot's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes had grown sharper. Tell me, when was the last time you spoke with Mr. Van Alden? 2 nights ago. Wade's smile was thin. He offered me money to forget the past. I refused. And after that? I wished him luck, Wade said lightly. Men like him don't need enemies. They have their own ghosts. As we walked away, I whispered, he doesn't seem bothered at all. Precisely, mon ami, and that is why I am most bothered. We descended into the small, windowless switchboard room where the scent of warm wiring and faint perfume mingled in the air. A nervous girl with auburn curls sat at the board, fingers poised above the plugs like a pianist preparing for her next performance. Poirot approached with his usual charm. Mademoiselle, I ask only for a simple truth. And you are the guardian of all conversations, are you not? The girl's eyes widened. Sir? The call that frightened Mr. Van Alden, where did it come from? She blinked rapidly. There wasn't a call, sir. Not through the switchboard. His line was silent all morning, until you gentlemen called for help. Hastings frowned. But that's impossible. We heard the phone ring ourselves. Ah, mon ami, impossible is such an untidy word. It merely means the truth is wearing a disguise. Poirot's fingertips drummed softly on the edge of the board. Are you absolutely certain? I asked the girl. No record at all. She shook her head. If it had come through me, it would be logged here. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Then we must consider an alternative. A call placed not from outside, but from within. The girl's breath caught. You mean from inside the suite? Perhaps, or perhaps from nearby. A room, a corridor phone, somewhere close enough to avoid the switchboard entirely. Then it could have been anyone in the hotel, I exclaimed. Exactement. And yet, mon ami, we already know the culprit. We simply do not yet understand the method. Poirot turned back to the girl. Mademoiselle, one final question. Is there a second telephone in Mr. Van Alden's suite? She hesitated, then nodded. There's a private line in the sitting room. Poirot's eyes sparkled. Ah, and there, Hastings, lies the answer to the impossible call. It was not a call from a stranger at all, but from someone already inside his world. As we left, I struggled to keep pace with Poirot's swift stride. But who could have known about the private line? Poirot's smile was secretive. Someone who knew Mr. Van Alden's every habit and his every fear. A loyal secretary, perhaps, or a daughter, or a fiancée. The truth, mon ami, it is like a cat. It hides under the sofa until one rattles the box of biscuits. Poirot sat at the small writing desk in our suite. The infamous typed letter spread before him like a patient under examination. He had already adjusted the desk lamp 3 times, ensuring the angle of light was neither too sharp nor too dim. His meticulous nature had always been something to admire or endure. I paced the room impatiently. It's just a crude threat, Poirot. Probably banged out on any old hotel typewriter. Ah, Hastings. And therein lies your error. Poirot raised a finger, his expression grave. A letter. It is never just a letter. It is a fingerprint of the mind, mon ami. He leaned closer, his green eyes glinting as he examined the uneven strokes of ink. Observe, Hastings. Look closely at the capital E in fate and the T in next. Do you see it? I squinted. They look the same to me. Poirot sighed, as though explaining sunlight to a blind man. They are not the same at all. The E is slightly crooked, oui? It leans drunkenly to the left. But the T, it is perfectly straight. What does that mean? I asked. It means, mon cher, that this letter was typed on not one machine, but 2. The first, a machine with a faulty alignment. The second, a perfectly maintained one. Why on earth would someone do that? I demanded. Poirot smiled faintly. To create confusion. To suggest a collaboration, or perhaps to conceal the true author behind the disguise of another. He lifted the letter with reverent care. The hands that typed this letter, Hastings, they were clever hands, but not clever enough. For there is one thing even the cleverest criminal cannot fake. And what's that? Their own fear. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. This letter, it is not the work of confidence, it is the work of desperation. The letter fluttered slightly as Poirot laid it back on the desk. There are 2 typewriters in this hotel that interest me now, mon ami. The machine in Mr. Van Alden's suite and the one used by Mademoiselle Pauline. Shall we investigate? We found Pauline Brinkerhoff at the corner of the business lounge, her head bent low over her work. In front of her lay a pile of torn paper, scraps so small they resembled confetti. Poirot approached like a cat stalking a mouse. Mademoiselle Pauline, you are industrious, no? But perhaps a little too thorough. She looked up, her face pale. It's nothing, just old notes. Old notes, new destruction, curious. Poirot plucked one fragment from the pile. See, Hastings, the edge here. It was torn in haste, with the hand trembling slightly. Pauline forced a smile. I like to keep things tidy. A most admirable quality, and yet tidiness often hides guilt. Pauline's hands clenched. I've already told you, I had nothing to do with what happened to Mr. Van Alden. Nothing? Not even assisting with the revision of his will. Poirot's voice was mild, but Pauline's flinch was unmistakable. I only typed what he dictated, she whispered. On which machine? She hesitated. His typewriter. Bon. And your own machine? The one you use for your personal notes? That too would be most interesting to examine. Pauline's hands trembled slightly. I don't see why that's necessary. Poirot smiled gently. Because, mademoiselle, even paper has memory, and typewriters, they confess far more than their operators. We walked back toward our suite in silence, Poirot unusually pensive. I could almost hear the wheels turning inside his head, each detail fitting, or refusing to fit, into the ever-evolving puzzle. At last, I could bear it no longer. You have some theory, Poirot. I can tell by your face. A theory? No, Hastings. Not a theory. A sensation. His fingers twitched at his lapel. There is a scent to this case, mon ami. A scent of familiarity. Familiarity? With whom? With everyone, and with no one. He stopped abruptly. You see, Hastings, this crime, it is not merely about money, nor even revenge. It is about something older, something that has been hiding in the heart for years. I groaned. Can't you ever speak plainly, Poirot? Where would be the joy in that? He smiled serenely. But I shall give you a gift, mon ami. A single word. He paused dramatically. Voice. Voice, I repeated, baffled. Exactement. The voice that frightened Van Alden. The voice that wrote the letter. The voice that has whispered through this case from the very beginning. I was more confused than ever. Whose voice? Poirot smiled, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Ah, that, Hastings, you must wait to discover. But soon, all voices shall be silent, because Poirot will speak, and he will speak the truth. The Grand Salon of the Savoy was the perfect setting for one of Poirot's celebrated revelations, a room rich with marble columns, ornate chandeliers, and the hushed expectation of impending drama. The suspects filed in one by one, each taking a seat in a wide arc of polished armchairs. There was an air of polite tension, like guests at a funeral, where the corpse had left a fortune. Dorothy Van Alden perched at the edge of her seat, her arms folded tightly, her face set in that brittle defiance we had come to know so well. Lydia Cartwright reclined gracefully, her practiced elegance betraying only the faintest tremor at her fingertips. Charles Pembroke stood by the window, hands in his pockets, his reflection shimmering faintly in the glass. Pauline Brinkerhoff, pale as parchment, sat apart from the others, her eyes fixed firmly on the carpet. Captain Wade leaned back, arms crossed, his weathered face as impassive as the stone lions guarding the hotel entrance. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, resplendent in his perfectly pressed evening suit, his patent leather shoes gleaming like mirrors, his moustaches quivered with anticipation. Mesdames et messieurs, you wonder perhaps why I have summoned you here. It is simple. Hercule Poirot is ready to speak. His words hung in the air like the opening chord of a symphony. I took my seat beside him, notebook at the ready. Though I had no idea where this was leading, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Poirot had solved it. There has been, in this matter, a great deal of confusion, Poirot continued. Letters, telephone calls, a collapse most mysterious. But confusion, it is the natural enemy of Poirot. He raised a finger. Tonight, mes amis, I shall sweep aside the fog and reveal to you the clear, shining truth. Hastings, ever the audience surrogate, I felt a delicious shiver of anticipation. This was the moment, the unveiling, when the mind of Poirot would transform scattered fragments into a perfect whole. The cause of death. Ah, it was not poison, nor the dagger, nor any of the traditional methods one might expect. Poirot smiled mysteriously. It was something far more elegant, and far more cruel. The room held its breath. Even Pembroke turned from the window, curiosity overcoming cynicism. Prepare yourselves, mes amis. For the truth, it is far stranger than you have imagined. Poirot took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. His voice dropped, compelling us all to lean in, as though a great secret were about to be whispered into the ear of the world. Mr. Van Alden was not poisoned, nor struck down by hand or weapon. No, he was killed by something far more insidious, his own mind. There was a collective murmur of disbelief. Even I, who had seen Poirot solve murders by the dozen, could scarcely believe what I was hearing. You saw with your own eyes, Poirot continued. He answered the telephone and collapsed. But what was it that reached him through the wire? Not words, but a voice he knew intimately, a voice from the grave. Lydia gave a soft gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Pauline's fingers twitched in her lap. Yes, mes amis, Poirot said. It was the voice of his first wife, a woman long dead. There were audible exclamations of disbelief, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. Non, I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe in fear and guilt. These are the shadows that haunt a man far more effectively than any spectre. He turned to the assembled suspects. Someone among you knew of Van Alden's greatest fear, that the curse laid upon him by his dying wife would one day claim him, and that someone used it, with devilish cunning, to strike him down. A recording, mon ami, Poirot said to me, as though explaining the weather. A recording of her voice, altered slightly, enough to seem spectral, but clear enough to be recognized instantly. Dorothy spoke for the first time. But why would a voice cause him to collapse? Poirot's gaze softened, almost pitying. Because fear, mademoiselle, is a knife more deadly than any blade. Your father had lived with that fear for years, buried it beneath wealth and power. But when it spoke to him again, he could bear no more. His heart, it broke beneath the weight of his own guilt. He paused, letting the silence settle. And that, mes amis, is the weapon. The voice of a ghost, the fear of the living, and the hand of someone who knew him too well. This was not murder by poison or pistol. This was murder by memory. Poirot turned to Charles Pembroke, who had maintained his air of detached amusement for much of the gathering. But now, his fingers drummed nervously against the arm of his chair, a small, betraying rhythm that did not escape Poirot's watchful eye. Monsieur Pembroke, you are a man who values precision, non? Precision in business, in negotiations, and I suspect in alibis. Pembroke's smile tightened. I told you already, Poirot. I was at my club all morning. Ah, yes, the club. A most useful sanctuary. But you forget one detail, monsieur. A detail so small and yet so fatal. You left the club. Pembroke's brows lifted in mock surprise. Briefly. To fetch my umbrella. Precisely. And do you know what time you left? Not at 10:30 as you claimed, but at exactly 10:42, a detail confirmed by your own doorman, whose logbook records all comings and goings. Hastings leaned forward, thrilled. That's right in the window when the telephone call was made. Exactement. Poirot's finger stabbed the air triumphantly. You see, monsieur, your umbrella. It was no more than a pretext. A reason to place you near Van Alden's suite at precisely the moment the fatal call was made. Pembroke's face paled slightly, but his voice remained smooth. You have no proof I made the call. But I do. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The hotel operator heard your voice just moments before the call connected. You spoke only briefly, to ask about the weather, but the accent, it was unmistakable. That proves nothing. Perhaps not in a court of law, but to Hercule Poirot, it proves that you were near the suite, close enough to place the call from the corridor telephone. Poirot stepped closer. Yet even that, monsieur, is not the final nail in your alibi. Pembroke's confidence faltered. What do you mean? Poirot held up a small silver matchbook. It was found beside the corridor phone, a matchbook from your club. Careless, monsieur. Very careless. Pembroke's mask slipped at last. I had nothing to do with his death, he snapped. I wanted to ruin him, yes, but in the market, not in his bedroom. Poirot spread his hands. We shall see, monsieur. We shall see. With Pembroke suitably shaken, Poirot turned his attention to Lydia Cartwright, who had grown increasingly still, her poised exterior beginning to crack. Her pearls lay forgotten in her lap, her knuckles white. Mademoiselle Lydia, you were engaged to Mr. Van Alden, were you not? Poirot's voice was gentler now, almost compassionate. Yes, she replied softly. And yet, a rumour has circulated. A whisper of an affair, of infidelity. Such a story, it has shadowed you throughout this day. But you see, mademoiselle, the story. It is entirely false. Lydia's eyes widened. What? False. Fabricated. Planted like a seed in fertile soil to draw attention away from the real matter at hand. Hastings' brow furrowed. But Van Alden believed it. He accused her himself. Oui, mon ami. And who placed that thought in his mind? Who whispered poison into his ear? Poirot glanced at Pauline Brinkerhoff, whose face was ashen. The loyal secretary, who knew every vulnerability, every insecurity her employer possessed. Lydia gasped. Pauline started the rumour? Poirot gave a small nod. Cleverly done. A single offhand comment, a misplaced note, a suggestion overheard at precisely the right moment, all leading a jealous man to believe he was betrayed. Pauline's mouth opened, but no words came. But why? I demanded. What did Pauline gain from turning Van Alden against Lydia? Time, Hastings. Time and distraction. Poirot's voice grew serious. The quarrel between Van Alden and Lydia was no accident. It was staged, engineered to ensure Van Alden's attention was focused on the wrong betrayal. Lydia's voice trembled. But why? Because Pauline needed him alone, vulnerable, ready to be manipulated by the ghostly voice that would soon follow. Poirot folded his hands. A mind distracted by jealousy is far easier to terrify. And the more suspicious he became of you, mademoiselle, the more guilt he felt for his own misdeeds. Hastings shook his head in amazement. So the affair, the whole thing, was a lie. A lie most diabolique. A lie designed not to protect the guilty, but to destroy the innocent. Poirot's expression was solemn. And all the while, the true culprit moved in the shadows, quietly orchestrating a murder that required no weapon at all. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. I never betrayed him. Poirot bowed slightly. Mademoiselle, the heart is rarely as guilty as the imagination. A hush had settled over the grand salon, broken only by the faint tick of the mantel clock and the occasional rustle of clothing as someone shifted uneasily in their seat. Pauline Brinkerhoff sat stiff-backed, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles glowed white. Poirot, with theatrical flair, took 2 precise steps toward her. His hands were clasped behind his back, his head tilted at the familiar angle that always preceded his most dramatic revelations. Mademoiselle Pauline, you have served Mr. Van Alden for many years. You knew his moods, his habits, his weaknesses, but most importantly, you knew his fears. Pauline's eyes darted left and right, as if searching for an escape route, but Poirot's voice held her captive. When one serves so closely for so long, one ceases to be merely a secretary. One becomes a keeper of secrets, a guardian of the past, and it is the past, mes amis, that killed Mr. Van Alden. Or rather, it was made to appear so. He paused, letting the silence settle, then continued with growing intensity. The letter, the quarrel, the strange phone call, they were not accidents. They were orchestrations, composed by a mind both clever and cruel. A mind who knew that Van Alden's own guilt was the most powerful weapon of all. Pauline's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Poirot's hand swept toward her. It was you, mademoiselle. You who typed the letter on 2 typewriters to confuse the trail. You who planted the rumor of Lydia's infidelity to distract suspicion, and you who staged the call that broke Mr. Van Alden's mind. There was a collective gasp, followed by a stunned silence. Pauline shook her head, her voice finally emerging, trembling but defiant. That's absurd. I was loyal to Mr. Van Alden, loyal to the end. Poirot's smile was both gentle and merciless. Non, mademoiselle. Loyalty was your mask. Beneath it, resentment, bitterness, and I think a heart long bruised by unspoken love. The room seemed to shrink around her as every eye fell upon Pauline. Hastings leaned toward me, whispering, I never suspected her. Nor did anyone, mon ami. That is why it was so effective. The silence held for a moment longer, until Poirot raised a single finger. But the most ingenious touch, the jewel in the crown of this crime, was the voice itself. He turned back to the assembled group. Mr. Van Alden did not die from poison, nor from violence. He died from the sound of a ghost, or rather, the sound of what he believed to be a ghost. Dorothy's voice, sharp with disbelief, broke in. You mean, the voice on the phone wasn't real? Poirot shook his head gravely. It was real, mademoiselle, but not as you imagine. It was a recording, carefully prepared and modified using a mechanical filter, designed to distort and age the voice, making it sound as though it came from beyond the grave. Lydia gave a soft gasp. But how could Pauline have known what his first wife's voice sounded like? Poirot's expression softened. Because Pauline was present when that voice was most powerful, in the final months of the first Mrs. Van Alden's life. Pauline transcribed her letters, her dictations, her final words. She heard the voice in fear and anger, in affection and accusation, and Pauline remembered. He turned back to Pauline. It was you who made the recording, using your own voice, adjusted to mimic hers. And when Van Alden answered the telephone, it was not a spirit he heard, but the clever imitation of a voice he could never forget. A voice that whispered only to him, calling him to judgment. Pauline's breath came faster, her composure unraveling. You have no proof. Ah, but I do, mademoiselle. Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew a spool of magnetic tape. This was found in your typewriter case. A curious place to hide such a thing, no? Hastings' eyes widened. You mean, she planned all of this in advance? Every detail, from the letter to the quarrel, to the very timing of the call. She led him to his own destruction, not with force but with fear. And fear, mon ami, is the most deadly weapon of all. Pauline's face crumpled, the weight of her carefully concealed hatred finally too heavy to bear. He deserved it, she whispered. He ruined her. He ruined me. Poirot gave a small bow. And yet, mademoiselle, revenge, it does not restore what is lost. It only adds to the burden of grief. Poirot stood at the center of the room, holding the infamous typed letter between two fingers, as though it were a specimen in need of dissection. The light from the grand chandelier caught the paper's edge, making it gleam faintly. A letter that had led us all on a merry dance, as Poirot would say. Mes amis, you have all wondered about this letter, the supposed warning from some shadowy blackmailer or enemy, a crude threat, a demand for silence, or perhaps the promise of exposure. He shook his head. But no, it was none of these things. It was not a demand. It was a device, a tool, expertly crafted to achieve a single purpose, to ignite fear. He let the letter flutter to the table. You see, the letter was not intended to extract money. No, it was designed to awaken the sleeping monster within Mr. Van Alden, his fear of retribution. His past, mes amis, was a graveyard of broken promises, discarded loyalties, and whispered curses. He believed, above all, that one day his sins would come for him. Hastings frowned. But why send it at all? If Pauline planned to frighten him with the phone call, wasn't that enough? Ah, mon ami, you forget the importance of anticipation. Fear is never so terrible as when it grows slowly, hour by hour. The letter was the seed planted in the morning, so that by the time the telephone rang, his mind had already walked halfway to its doom. Poirot turned the letter over, tapping it lightly with his finger. And notice the detail, mes amis. The letter was typed on two different machines. One belonged to Pauline, the other to Mr. Van Alden himself. His own hand was made to type part of his death warrant. A delicious irony, non? Pauline's face was ghostly pale, her breathing shallow. I only meant to scare him, that's all. Non, mademoiselle, you meant to break him, and you succeeded. The letter was not a threat from outside, but a whisper from within, his own guilty conscience made flesh upon the page. Poirot's voice grew softer, almost reverent, as he took a slow turn about the room. This, mes amis, was not an ordinary murder. There was no dagger in the dark, no vial of poison slipped into a glass of wine. This was a crime of the mind, a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He gestured toward Pauline. Our Mademoiselle Brinkerhoff understood her employer better than anyone. She knew his weaknesses, his fears, the ghosts that walked with him at night. And so, she did not strike at his body, but at his soul. The room was silent, save for the faint creak of leather as Pembroke shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Lydia sat frozen, as if the full weight of what had occurred was only now settling upon her. The voice on the telephone, it was her voice, altered to resemble the first Mrs. Van Alden. The letter, crafted to remind him that enemies were always watching. The quarrel with Mademoiselle Lydia, engineered to ensure his mind was already unsettled. Each detail, carefully placed like steps in a dance, leading to the moment when his own heart betrayed him. Hastings exhaled softly. Good heavens, Poirot, it's terrifying. Oui, mon ami. It is also the work of a mind most formidable. A murder where no hand was laid upon the victim. It is the perfect crime, n'est-ce pas? Poirot stood very still, hands clasped before him, his moustaches twitching with the satisfaction of a puzzle completed. You see, mes amis, there is great danger in the past. It does not lie quietly. It stirs, it whispers, it demands to be heard. And when a mind, already weighted with guilt, hears that whisper, it requires only the slightest push to send it tumbling into the abyss. He turned to Pauline. You, mademoiselle, gave that push. You did not kill with poison or blade. You killed with memory. You turned fear itself into your weapon. Pauline's voice was hollow. I only wanted him to understand, to feel what we felt when he destroyed our lives. Poirot's expression was unreadable. Ah, but revenge, mademoiselle, is a dish most bitter, even when served cold. He stepped back, folding his arms. This crime, it is, in its own way, a thing of beauty. A crime executed entirely within the mind, leaving no trace but a broken heart and a terrified soul. And so, mes amis, I declare, this is the most elegant murder Hercule Poirot has ever had the misfortune to solve. Hastings shook his head in disbelief. And to think, we were chasing poison bottles and daggers all along. Poirot smiled faintly. It is always the mind, mon cher Hastings. The cleverest crimes, they are written first upon the heart. For a moment, Pauline Brinkerhoff sat perfectly still. It was the unnatural stillness of someone whose last defense had crumbled, leaving only the raw, exposed truth. Her hands, so long accustomed to typing Van Alden's orders, now gripped the arms of her chair with such force that the leather groaned in protest. The assembled guests held their breath, waiting for her to speak. But it was Poirot, ever merciful in victory, who broke the silence. Mademoiselle Pauline, it is over. There is no need to fight the truth. It stands before you, in all its clarity. You have been loyal, yes, but loyalty twisted by bitterness becomes a terrible thing, n'est-ce pas? Pauline's breath caught in her throat, and then the words began to tumble out, half whisper, half sob. I gave him everything, years of my life, my time, my care. I knew every secret, every fear. I shielded him from his enemies and his own folly. And yet, to him, I was nothing. Her voice sharpened, bitterness cutting through the tears. He never saw me, Poirot, not really. I was a shadow at his elbow, a convenient machine that knew where he left his cufflinks and which document needed signing. And when he decided to marry that girl, that beautiful, careless girl, it was as if I ceased to exist entirely. Poirot's expression was grave, but gentle. And so you chose to remind him of the one thing he could never forget, his first wife, the one ghost he could not banish. Pauline gave a brittle laugh. It was almost too easy. His guilt had been festering for years. All it took was the right voice, the right words. When he heard her, when he believed her spirit had come to claim him, his heart simply gave out. She covered her face with trembling hands. I didn't want him dead, Poirot. I only wanted him to know what it felt like, to live in fear every day, to feel small, to feel invisible. But fear, mademoiselle, it is a creature you cannot tame. Once unleashed, it devours all. Poirot's voice softened. And now, it has devoured you as well. Pauline's shoulders slumped. There was no defiance left, only a woman broken by the weight of her own vengeance. With Pauline's confession hanging in the air, Poirot stepped forward, adjusting his cuffs with the satisfaction of an artist placing the final brush stroke on a masterpiece. The room, though full, felt hushed, as though the very walls were listening. Mes amis, now that the truth has emerged, permit me to walk you back through the path of deduction, so that you may see for yourselves how the little grey cells performed their labour. Hastings, pen poised, gave a faint sigh of relief. This was always my favourite part, when Poirot explained what had seemed utterly impossible only hours before. First, the letter. It was too perfect, no? A threat designed to terrify, but with no real demand, only fear itself. A letter designed not to extort, but to unnerve. Who would know precisely which words would haunt Van Alden the most? Only someone who knew his past intimately. He raised a finger. Then, the quarrel with Mademoiselle Lydia, a quarrel too conveniently timed. A lover's spat at the very hour a phone call from the dead was due to arrive. A quarrel planted, like a seed, to distract from the real danger. Poirot paced gently, his shoes whispering against the polished floor. The call itself, that was the cleverest part. A recording, disguised and distorted, but unmistakable to the ears of a guilty man. The voice of the woman he had wronged, calling from beyond. He turned to Pauline. And who knew that voice better than anyone? Who typed her letters, answered her calls, stood at her bedside as she whispered her final words? You, mademoiselle. Pauline flinched, but said nothing. Add to this the destruction of the notepad, the very place where rehearsal notes were scribbled, the staged affair planted in Van Alden's mind, and of course, the cunning use of the two typewriters to create confusion, each detail a brushstroke upon the canvas of fear. He clasped his hands. And so we arrive, mes amis, at the truth. A murder committed not by dagger or pistol, but by the human mind itself. A murder where the victim's own heart delivered the fatal blow. Hastings exhaled slowly. You make it sound so simple now. But it was never simple, mon ami. It was a performance. And in performances, one must always follow the director. In this case, the hand behind the curtain belonged to Pauline Brinkerhoff. With that, Poirot gave a small, theatrical bow. The room sat in stunned silence, the last puzzle piece falling into place. Poirot stood by the fireplace, the infamous letter between his fingertips, gently waving it back and forth, as if it were some delicate butterfly caught in his grasp. This letter, mes amis, was the first whisper of truth. Its deception was charming, yet fatally flawed. Hastings, who had grown increasingly confident after Poirot's dramatic reveal, puffed himself up slightly. Because of the mismatched typewriters, eh? Poirot gave a small, approving nod. Très bien, Hastings. For once, you have observed. 2 distinct typewriters, one belonging to Mr. Van Alden himself, and one belonging to Mademoiselle Pauline. He raised a finger. And why 2? Because the letter had 2 purposes. One part, typed by Pauline, was the warning itself, the threat, the drama. The other, typed by Van Alden under Pauline's assistance, was his own new will. There were murmurs around the room, and I frowned. But why would Van Alden use his own typewriter for a letter threatening himself? Poirot smiled. He would not. But Pauline, Pauline was clever. She used his machine to type part of the letter days before, under the guise of dictating his new will. Hastings shook his head. The poor man signed his own death warrant without knowing it. Precisely, mon ami. It was a most elegant trick. The warning came, not from a stranger, but from his own hands. What greater terror is there than the fear we write for ourselves? Poirot turned from the letter to the telephone, resting innocently on the side table, as if unaware it had played such a diabolical role. And now, the telephone, the so-called call from the dead. Poirot's fingers trailed lightly across the receiver. So much drama, non? A call from beyond the grave, delivering death through the wire. But the truth, it was far simpler. The call came not from outside the hotel, but from within. He tapped the table with finality. The private line in the suite itself, a trick performed from within the room. Pauline placed the call before leaving for breakfast, programming the device to ring at precisely the right moment. All Van Alden had to do was pick it up. I stared. But why did the operator have no record? Because the switchboard was never involved. It was a self-contained performance. The voice on the line was recorded beforehand. Pauline's voice, altered to mimic the first Mrs. Van Alden. A ghost conjured at the press of a button. Lydia paled. He truly believed it was her. Oui, mademoiselle. And that belief, that fear, killed him more surely than any bullet. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the soft rustling of papers as Poirot lifted the revised will. And now, mes amis, the cruelest twist of all. This will, the one Pauline helped him draft, names an unnamed beneficiary for a personal gift. Pauline's head jerked up, her breath catching. What? Poirot gave a small, sorrowful smile. You, mademoiselle. Mr. Van Alden had planned to leave you his private art collection, a gesture of gratitude for your years of loyal service. Her eyes filled with tears. He was going to leave me something. Oui. The man you sought to punish had, in his own way, remembered you after all. But now, you shall receive nothing except justice. Hastings shook his head. If only she had waited. Poirot sighed. Ah, but revenge rarely has patience, mon ami. And so, the tragedy completes itself. As we stepped into the corridor, Poirot came to a sudden halt. His gaze fixed on a small, crooked picture frame, hanging just askew. With exaggerated precision, he straightened it, stepping back to admire his work. Perfection, Hastings. It matters in all things, even crime. A crooked frame, like a careless clue, disturbs the symmetry. And Hercule Poirot cannot abide disorder. I chuckled. It's a wonder you didn't arrest the decorator. Poirot smiled, his moustaches twitching. Not every crime, mon ami, requires Poirot. Some, a hammer and nail will suffice. With that, he swept off down the corridor, leaving me to follow, shaking my head in fond exasperation. Absolutely. Here's a strong, engaging ending, tailored to match the tone and style of a classic Hercule Poirot story, while also serving as an effective YouTube outro for your audience. It ties everything together beautifully, gives a sharp closing message, adds a clever Hastings remark, poses a thought-provoking mystery question, and finishes with a polished call to action. As the doors of the Grand Salon closed behind us, I couldn't help but marvel at Poirot's brilliance once again. It wasn't the footprints or fingerprints that solved the case. It was the secrets hidden in hearts and minds, the fear lurking just beneath polite conversation, and the smallest details that others would simply dismiss. Hercule Poirot always knew that human nature leaves a far clearer trail than any criminal ever intends. Even the cleverest schemes, disguised as whispers, staged as hauntings, cannot escape the relentless logic of the little grey cells. Poirot paused at the end of the corridor, adjusting his immaculate cuffs, and I couldn't resist one last question. "Tell me, Poirot," I said, "do you ever tire of being right?" His moustaches twitched with amusement. "Mon cher Hastings, to tire of perfection? Never. But to see others resist it, that is the tragedy." As we stepped into the lift, I gave a wry smile. "Next time I see a crooked picture frame, I'll be sure to call you before Scotland Yard." What do you think was the single most important clue that gave Pauline away? Was it the letter, the voice, or perhaps her trembling hands? Share your theory in the comments below. We'd love to hear your detective instincts. If you enjoyed unraveling this classic Hercule Poirot mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more cunning cases and brilliant deductions to life. And remember, there's always another mystery just around the corner. Stay tuned for the next thrilling investigation with Poirot and Hastings, coming soon.